And early on, the British also came into conflict with the Indians, for the Brits brought with them rigid notions of land ownership. Once they acquired land, they allowed no trespass or use by others. They acted in the old country manner of land ownership, and when British settlers bought or were granted land and refused Indians even the right to hunt or fish on it, camp on it, travel across it, this strange behavior created hostility. Indians didn't understand the concept of land ownership. How could anyone own land? The land belonged to the Great Spirit who created it. Man was allowed to use it for life purposes, but not to own it. By so rigidly controlling the land, the British cut off the Indians from ancient hunting grounds, burial places, seasonal gatherings, all traditional, important aspects of their lives. This put the majority of Indians firmly in camp with the French, for the French held no territorial aims, only use. For other reasons, Indians often favored the French over the British settlers. French men alone in the new lands began relationships with Indian maidens, some even marrying them, though they may have left a wife in Bordeaux. And the French Catholic clergy's proselytizing of Native Americans was less coercive than that of the Anglican Church. But mainly, it was a trade between Indians and French that built interdependence. By the 1730s, tensions were rising between the two cultures. Men had crossed the mountains on horseback and afoot, and though they hadn't found passage for their wagons to transport families, still they encroached on Indian-French prerogatives. At this point in our narrative, we need to pull together several disparate threads of history to provide context to the ultimate development of events. In the 1730s to 40s, Joseph Edwards moved his family to a 400-acre parcel of land in the Kicapin River Valley, here in what was to become Capon Bridge. From Chester County, Pennsylvania, he brought with him a wife and 3 sons. A daughter was born here after the family's arrival. Edwards was a wealthy man in terms of possessions and land back in Pennsylvania, and we don't know why he left the community near Philadelphia with doctors, schools, and churches to come to this uncivilized, dangerous frontier. But he settled on his land, building a house, barn, and outbuildings on the river, and he prospered. In 1748, a group of wealthy, influential Virginians, including Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, the Virginia patriot George Mason, George Washington's 2 elder half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, Thomas Lee, and others, formed the Ohio Company of Virginia, a commercial enterprise, and petitioned the Crown for a land grant in the Ohio country, an exceptionally fertile area. King George II granted them 500,000 acres, 200,000 immediately, and another 300,000 if they settled 100 families on it within 7 years and built a fort to protect the settlers. When the Ohio Company began selling off parcels and the buyers showed up to build and live on the disputed land, denying others access, the Indians and French reacted as one would expect. Tensions were heightened. George Washington, born in 1732, had by 1748 finished the schooling expected of a well-born gentleman of the period. He had his numbers, could read and write a decent cursive hand, had some rhetoric, and was ready for a career. Not the eldest son, he did not get first inheritance. His elder half-brother, Lawrence, inherited Little Hunting Creek Farm on the Potomac, later renaming it Mount Vernon, after British Admiral Vernon, under whom he'd served in the Royal Navy. George wanted to go to sea, as Lawrence had done, but his family was convinced that the young man must find some other field of endeavor. He'd shown an interest in surveying, and as he had a little geometry in addition to his numbers, he had an edge. He took instruction in Fredericksburg, Virginia, but had really settled on nothing. George lived at Mount Vernon with Lawrence's family. Their nearest neighbor of comparable social standing was the William Fairfax family, who owned Belvoir Estate nearby. Fairfax's daughter was married to Lawrence Washington, and George was popular in both families.